With the explosion in the recent years of terms like microservices and all the problems and the solutions that they bring with, terms like contract driven testing or consumer driven contract tests started popping around. And especially if you're using Postman, you may have noticed a functionality called contract testing. You're wondering how to use that, what does it bring, and generally, what are consumer driven contract tests and how you can use them in Postman. Hi there, this is Valentine and welcome to another Postman tutorial. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video we'll try to understand what are contract tests, what are consumer-driven contract tests, and how you can properly use them in Postman and how you can integrate them in your CI/CD pipeline. So let's get started with this tutorial. To understand what we are talking about, we need to start really with the basics. So what is a consumer? What is a provider? Say you have just built a house and you need some utilities like electricity, water, and so on. What you would typically do is you will go to your local electric utility company and say something like, hey, I just built this new house. I really need some electricity from you guys. And they will say, sure, let's sign a contract. We will provide you electricity and you agree to pay us based on whatever you use plus a fixed tax or something like that. In this case, the electric utility company will be the provider because it provides something to you. In this case, it provides electricity, and you will be the consumer because you will be using that electricity to wash your clothes, to watch TV, to power your laptop, and so on. So this is the provider and consumer concept. And here in the middle, of course, we have the contract that regulates exactly what are the expectations of both parties. Moving a bit to the software-related problems that we're typically facing when dealing with APIs. Let's say we have this customer's service. We can call it a microservice if you prefer. It doesn't really matter. And what this service is supposed to do is to manage some customer data. For example, it will have everything that's related to the customer, like first name, last name, email address, and so on. But this is great because we have a service that has a specific role, and any other services that require any customer information can go to this service and say, hey, give me the information that you have. In this case, for example, the billing service will also have some information, but connected to the customer. It will know exactly what the customer has used in terms of services in a specific month. And probably at the end of the month, it will want to generate an invoice and send it to the customer. Of course, in order to do that, you need to know the first name, the last name, the address, and so on. So for that reason, the billing service will go to the customer service and extract this information that is needed in order to generate the invoice. Again, in this case, the customer service is the provider as it provides this data to the billing service, which is the consumer. Now, there's definitely a similarity with the previous example I've given, in the sense that the provider and the consumer still need to have sort of a contract to understand what kind of data is available and how to access it. And when working with APIs, it tends to have different forms. Sometimes if you are trying to understand how to use an API, you may see this Swagger documentation, you may get a Postman collection, or you may even see an open API schema which explains which endpoints are available, how you can send data, and what you should expect to retrieve. Now again, a contract is simply an agreement. And in most cases, this contract is simply what the provider generates. It's something that's more or less saying, I built this API, here's the documentation for it, here are all the endpoints and what kind of data you can get. It's more or less take it or leave it, which even in the case with your electric utility company, it's kind of the same. You're not negotiating the contract. The provider is just giving you, look, this is the standard thing that we have. If you don't like it, take your business somewhere else. And this has been the approach for a long period of time. The provider just publish the documentation somewhere and any consumer can simply use it. So let's take a look at how this works as it stands without getting into the whole contract testing thing. So what I have here is a very simple microservice written in Java using the Spring Boot framework. It's super simple and only exposes two endpoints. So I've started this service and I will go to Postman and show you how this works, how you can interact with it. So the service will have two endpoints. Get customers is one of them. So the address of the service / customers. And this will provide a list of customers with all the information that's available inside. Additionally, there's also another endpoint which allows you to get information on a specific customer and maybe get a more detailed view into that. So it's a very, very simple example. Nevertheless, it's still something that's very important to understand at this stage. The collection that you see here is designed to test this API. So for example, when we're getting the customers, if you look here into the testing part, we're doing some assertions. For example, we're testing that the status code is 200. We're testing that the content type is JSON. And we have also defined a schema. And we're defining here what is expected in terms of the response. And we're validating this. If you're interested more in schema validation, I will link you in the video description and here on top another tutorial I did on schema validation. The same idea applies also to this other endpoint that gets only a single customer. Again, status, content type, and the schema validation, all part of the API testing process, just to understand if this API works properly. And because we want to do continuous integration and maybe later continuous deployment, we also have a pipeline here. I've built this pipeline using GitLab CI. And this is a very modern and very effective continuous integration and continuous deployment tool that can help you with a lot of your DevOps practices. So if you want to learn about GitLab CI, I will link a tutorial right here on top and also in the video description. I'll just give you a quick overview why I'm using GitLab CI. So idea here is I'm storing the code in GitLab CI, and every time I make a change to this code, I want to build a project, run the unit tests, build a Docker image, and finally, on that Docker image that has been built, I want to run this API test that have been written in Postman. So I can look into them, and here using Newman, the tool to automate this entire execution, I'm running here this collection that you have seen, and just making sure that everything works properly. So far, absolutely nothing special. This has been the normal workflow when you're working with Postman for API testing. You have a project. Most of the time, this is an API that you're building and you want to test. And you want to use all the power of Postman in order to integrate it with CI/CD tools so that you can get feedback when something doesn't work anymore. Now, let's take the following scenario. One developer notices that there is a problem in the response. Instead of first name, it's actually a misspell, and decides to correct this error. Now, obviously, this developer knows what he's doing and will not just make the change and hope that everything will work properly. He knows that, of course, we'll have to update here the tests, the API tests that are running inside the Postman collection, and we'll also have to notify anyone that's using this API about this change, or to try to make it in a compatible way. So practically, in this case, the provider will make a change to the contract, and this change can take multiple forms. It can be done in a way that it's backward compatible. It can be by releasing a new version, but most of the time, managing backwards compatibility and having a lot of versions that run in parallel are pretty hard. So the cleanest way would be to talk with the consumers and notify them about this change, or that starting with a specific date, this particular field will be renamed so that everyone has time to check this. The traditional approach to this has been like figuring out who's using your service and notifying them. What happened in the recent years with the explosion in microservices is that there are no longer 2 or 3 services who may be using your API that you have created. There can be dozens of them, maybe hundreds of them inside your organization. You have absolutely no idea who these people are and if they're using it. And especially in these complex architectures, even the consumers themselves, they're not always 100% sure what they are using. Because if you built something like 2 years ago, probably not sure, have I used the first name or haven't I used it in this? It can be really confusing from this point of view. And generally, like sending emails, oh, changes, this will change and this will change, tends not to work so well. The provider in this case is really faced with this problem of, no, I'm trying to improve my API. I'm trying to make it better. But at the same time, I have absolutely no idea what's happening here. Who is using my API and how? So this is where the idea of consumer-driven contracts comes in. Let's try to understand a bit what's going on. We still have the provider, and we have the consumers who are getting data, and it can be a lot of consumers that are getting data from the provider. And of course, the provider will still have like this contract, will still have the specification of what's available. For example, a very simple form will say, hey, this endpoint will give you the customer ID, the first name, phone, and so on. Initially, the provider doesn't know what consumer A is using, what consumer B is using. Probably the provider will know that there is consumer A and B using some data, but what exactly? No idea. And as you remember, we were at the problem where we had to rename a field because it was misspelled. A consumer-driven contract is simply consumer A coming or consumer B coming and saying, hey, I'm using from your API the first name and the email. This is my consumer contract. This is what I'm using. In a pretty similar fashion, consumer B will say, I'm using first name, I'm using the last name property, and I'm using the address, because for whatever reason, I need to send this information. So now, if the provider decides to rename the first name, it will know that it has to notify consumer A and consumer B. Of course, consumer-driven contracts just a way of making transparent what will happen. And it doesn't magically fix problems for everyone. It just allows the provider to go directly to the respective consumer and collaborate on what can be done in order to update the API and to move on without having an overhead of a lot of API versions, a lot of compatibility fields, and a lot of weird things that sometimes do occur in APIs. Also, by having this information, the provider can notice that taking a contract gives information about what's being used, but also what's not being used. For example, often contracts are executable. They sort of contain some tests, some assertions that the provider can run locally without a lot of effort and can tell, look, I've executed all these contracts. I removed, for example, a field and nobody's complaining, which means most likely if all the arrangements, all the contracts are valid and the consumers ensure that these contracts are up to date, I can remove this phone field and I don't even have to notify anyone about this because apparently nobody's using it. So consumer-driven contracts that are executable, that have these tests into them, give the provider a lot of flexibility and a lot of insights in how the API is being used by the consumers. And previously, this has not been possible. So generally, consumer-driven contracts is not a technology. It's not something that you can just install. It's not a plugin or something like this. It is a concept and it revolves along some principles, some ideas, but overall, it is just an approach to solving a problem. So here are some advantages that consumer-driven contract tests have. I already mentioned this before, but now for the first time, the provider will know who the consumers are. It's no longer a one-way communication. I'm publishing something and I have no idea who is using it and which is the most popular functionality that I have and so on, and when can I make changes to something. And the provider can also start making changes to the API without breaking existing services, because existing services will say what they are using. So if the contracts are valid, this gives the provider a lot of flexibility. And it also reduces the overhead of getting a lot of people into meetings, trying to figure out if I change something to the API, who is affected by this, trying to find solution. If the provider knows exactly who is using the API, can closely collaborate only with the people who are responsible for that respective API. And the great thing about consumer-driven contract tests is that they integrate very well with continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. So anytime a developer makes a change that breaks anything, that change can be easily detected without actually breaking any services. So it can all be encapsulated in the continuous integration pipeline and to give really fast feedback. Most of the time, this consumer-driven contract test can also be executed locally, giving the respective developer who wants to make a change instant feedback as fast as under 1 minute. So now let's jump back in Postman and implement a contract-driven test for this API. So we said previously that the billing service relies on the customer service. I'm going to take a quick look at the billing service to understand what exactly is happening. So this is the billing service API. I will try to get the invoice with number 1. And as you can see, there are some information that appear here. The main information that's being used is the first name and the last name of the customer. Obviously, this information comes from the consumer service. We can even take a look at the code that we have here, and we can see that the endpoint that's being used to extract this information is the customer service / customers / the customer ID. So it's only actually one endpoint that's used from this entire API, and from that endpoint, 3 fields are being used: title, first name, and last name. So let's go back in Postman and write consumer-driven contract test. Consumer-driven contract tests in Postman, it's not a separate feature. It's not somewhere inside Postman hidden and you have never seen it before. We're practically using the exact same interface and the exact same techniques that we are using in Postman to write API tests, but this time to focus them in the direction of consumer-driven tests. And after this, I will explain you some differences to API testing, but generally, just remember this: consumer-driven contract tests is just a concept, it's just an approach. It's not a hidden feature inside Postman that you can just enable and then suddenly you're doing contract tests. In the way you write those tests that makes a difference. So I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. The best way to start is to simply by modifying the existing collection that explains how to use the respective API. So I'm going to go here and going to duplicate this. I'm going to rename it to make it clear that this is a contract test. And we'll try to make it explicit who is using this. So I'm going to say here by billing, so that we can easily identify who has written this contract test. And as you remember, we're not using the endpoint get customers. So we can simply delete it from here. And we're using only get customer by ID. So we can now go to this test and try to understand, try to define and see it as a contract and be very specific regarding what we're trying to do. For example, if it's relevant for us that we're getting a status to 100, we may want to make this explicit. If we're using this in our application, the application expects this to contain a header content type that is application JSON. It will definitely make sense to keep this as well. But if we're looking at the schema validation that we have here, definitely this schema is not important to us because we're not using everything that's inside here. Just looking at the properties, we can easily eliminate the properties that are no longer needed. So first name, we're using that. Last name, we're using that. Title, we're using that. But gender, now, we're not actually using that. So why should we test something that we're not using? Again, I'm going to adapt here the schema. And now we have everything that we need that is being used by our API. I'm going to select here the right environment. And as you can see, the test results are now valid. Now, by default, this will not make it a contract test. I need to somehow exchange the tests, me as a consumer, with the provider. There are different ways of handling this. Probably one of the easiest ways is to have a shared repository or inside the customer service to create a folder where you could insert those respective tests. This is what I did. Inside the customers, there is a folder called contract tests, and it will have a script that will automatically detect any tests that have been added and will start running them automatically. This is what we're going to do. We're going to export this Postman collection into this contract tests folder. So I'm here inside the customers project. I'm going inside the folder contract tests, and I'm going to simply export here the file as a JSON file. And once this has been exported, you can see here inside contract tests, and I have here a very nice script that will look at all the collections inside this folder and anything that ends with a specific extension .postman_collection.json, it will add it and start executing the tests. So finally, to our GitLab CI pipeline, we still need to add something. So after we run this, let's say API tests, we can go ahead and add here a new stage. So what's happening here, it's pretty simple. We have here these contract tests. After we have built an image with a customer service, which theoretically could be deployed, of course, we still have the API tests that could fail. But let's say if you want to remove a field or something like this, you may just want to know and execute a contract test. Just want to make sure that all the contracts that have been added by the consumers are now properly running. This is just a piece of code to get everything to run. And this is a separate stage. So I'm gonna create this stage and make it part of the pipeline. And I'll show you the graphical thing in just a few seconds after I commit this. But the main idea here is I've made a contract test part of my CI pipeline so that anytime I make a change to the code that may break something that consumer is using, these respective tests will start failing. So I'm going to commit this. I'm going to take a look at how the pipeline looks like. And after waiting a few minutes, we can take a look at the pipeline and we'll be able to see that a new stage has been added, the contract test stage. What this contract stage does is pretty simple. It will take the Docker image that has been built previously. It will take all the collections, all the consumer-driven contract tests written by the consumers in form of Postman collections. We'll go one by one. In this case, we have only one. We'll execute them. In this case, you will see here contract test, consumers service by billing. So billing is the consumer that has written this contract test and checks a few things like the status code, the content type. It only runs a specific endpoint. And this is something that has been started inside the CI pipeline. It has started the Docker image. Nothing has been even deployed to a test or to a pre-production system or anything like this. When using Docker, you can really easily start the application, run your tests, and try to understand if things are still working the way they're supposed to work. In this case, they're working properly. And this also allows for a lot of scalability when other providers, when other consumers start using the customer service, you can simply add their Postman collections and then the CI pipeline will automatically pick them up, will execute them, and this will give the provider a lot of insights regarding how the consumers are using this. Now, inside Postman, in case you have used this API functionality to design your API, in this case, I have defined here this OpenAPI schema. Actually, it has been automatically generated. If you're looking here at this testing part, you can add your collection. So this is the API test collection for the customer service. You can do the schema validation here, and you will be able to see that the schema corresponds to the collection. So the way the endpoints are structured and the inputs, it corresponds to the schema. And you also have this part here with contract tests. This has been pretty confusing for a lot of you, and I've gotten a lot of questions regarding this. So what we can theoretically do now is we can add an existing contract test, and this will be the contract test that we're adding. You might think that this validation thing here will actually start running and validating the contract test that we have written. Actually, it doesn't. What this will do is we'll simply look at the schema and we'll look at the collection and we'll notice that some endpoints are missing. So if you're using these contract tests and you haven't included like the entire contract, you're using the consumer-driven approach, you will have here a list of differences. So the idea is disregard this. This is just a way to document the kind of collections that you have so that you can see them. If you have a contract test, the idea is you can link it here somewhere at the test sheets or check here the validation, but this will be a manual check of the validation. You cannot use this with Newman. Overall, you can just simply link them here and more or less forget about them. It's just a way to make transparent, for this API, which contract tests are. Currently, this functionality is by no means integrated with Newman, so you cannot automate this. So when we're talking about Postman, apart from this aspect here that mentions contract tests, there is no specific functionality designed to help you write contract tests. So what I showed in this example is just a way of doing it. It's not the only way of doing it. It's just the approach that I took in order to provide you with a realistic example. Now you need to understand a few things. Since the functionality in Postman seems pretty similar to what we are using to write API tests in general, you may be wondering what are the differences between writing an API test and writing consumer-driven contract tests. It's quite a valid question. And again, consumer-driven contract tests is an approach. It's not something that's written in a specification or in a book. So you may find different ideas or different approaches to doing this. So there's nothing written in stone. But generally, the idea is that an API test will typically be written by the provider, because the provider will want to test the API, doesn't want to rely on some contract tests that the consumer may or may not write. So API tests in general will still exist, but the provider will focus on different things than what the consumer will focus on. And consumer-driven test, of course, is written by the consumer. Now, the API test will test the entire API, will test all the endpoints, will test everything that is to be tested, while the consumer-driven contract test will only test what the consumer actually uses. As the example with the properties, if I'm only using first name and last name, I will only test if first name and last name exist. And I actually do not care if anything else is there or not, because this is the only thing that I'm using. In the case of API tests, the idea is that you want to test the functionality. You want to test different business use cases, workflows. Generally, you can say that API tests are more complex, especially in more complex applications where you have workflows and such. So that's important from that point of view. Now, with the consumer-driven contract test, you really do not want to test the functionality. You don't want to duplicate what the API tests already tested. You just want to say, if I can put it like in simple terms, you just want to test like what are the inputs, what are the outputs. So I'm saying you did this, I'm expecting that you're sending this back. I'm not gonna get into like testing, if I have a calculator API, I'm gonna test if that calculator API will, if I send 1 and 2, it will return 3. We'll just test, look, I will send you 2 numbers and I expect back also a number. So I don't care if you say 1 and 2 make 4. It's not my problem as a consumer-driven contract test to make sure that your API is working. I just want to make sure that what I'm sending and what I'm retrieving is known by you, that you know that I'm using these respective properties, that I'm using these respective endpoints. And of course, this entire concept of consumer-driven contract tests will not really work with APIs that you do not control. So this is a great concept in terms of APIs that are developed within your organization if everyone adopts this approach. But you cannot go to Facebook and say, hey, Facebook, excuse me, I have here this consumer-driven contract test. Make sure that you run it next time when you deploy. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day. This is not the way how it works. Now, you can still write a contract test to test that the Facebook API still works separate from your application so that if something changes in an API, you will be notified. But it's a bit outside of the scope of this. So typically, this is not really considered to be part of the consumer-driven contract test idea. Thank you for sticking until the end. I want you to live with a few things. I know this has been a very long tutorial and probably a lot of the technologies and a lot of things that I've showed, you're not 100% familiar with them. And trust me, that's totally fine. You don't really have to do everything that I did. I just wanted to show you a simple example. Now, what I want you to remember is that consumer-driven contract testing is simply an approach. It's not a tool. It's not a solution. It's not something that you install and all of a sudden all the problems are solved. You apply an approach to solve a problem, so you first need to really understand the problem. If you have this problem, it can be solved with many tools because it's only an approach, it's only an idea. Of course, one of these tools that can be used for contract-driven tests is Postman. It hasn't been necessarily designed for this, but you can say that it supports this use case as well. Just as well, there are other tools that have been built having contract-driven tests as an approach in mind. And of course, each approach has an opinion on how to do this. Probably the most popular tools out there that I know is Pact, which is a general framework, and also Spring Cloud Contracts, especially for projects that are Java-based and use Spring. Probably many other tools out there to do contract-driven testing. Just wanted to point out that, Postman hasn't been really designed for contract-driven tests. It's something that can be used for, but it can also be used for many other things. So in that regard, in Postman, there is no hidden functionality that you haven't seen before that supports contract-driven testing. So with that, I would like to thank you for watching this long tutorial. I hope it was useful, but at the same time, I know I cannot cover everything that needs to be said regarding consumer-driven contract testing. If you have any questions or if you have any ideas for other tutorials, make sure that you leave a comment in the section below. I'll do my best to create other tutorials in this direction if this is something that interests you, or to give you a hand if you're facing a specific problem. As always, if this tutorial was helpful, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to this channel for more Postman tutorials or continuous integration with different tools. Thank you again for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.